We're going to do Aristotle's De Anima. One of the things that I wanted to show you in class was the painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. I'm pretty sure you can get a better image of this. I didn't see this was so pixely when I put it on the PowerPoint. But some of you might already know this, that figures that are at the center of the School of Athens are Socrates and Aristotle. And one of the things that Raphael does in the painting is that with the hand signals, he is representing the different philosophical schools that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, on the other hand, are going to represent. As we talked about in class, Socrates and Plato have this idea of the forms, of the way in which a form will become the essence or the blueprint for concepts. If we find a form of justice, under that form of justice, everything that is just will have this shared part, as I talked about in the Phaedo, right? If we talk about the form of beauty, everything that we see as beautiful will share on that same form of beauty. So when Raphael depicts Socrates pointing upwards, he is talking about this hierarchical belief of epistemological and metaphysical qualities that have to do with the forms, the Platonic forms being the highest kind of reality. On the other hand, Aristotle points downwards, and that's going to represent the way in which Aristotle moves in an empirical, more sort of scientific kind of experiment. For Aristotle, the things that need to be comprehended by us must be comprehended from how they appear to us, and from that we can start forming definitions, rules, concepts, categories that will be able to be applied to everything and every kind of knowledge. So that's what the School of Athens represents in that central piece. Raphael represented other great thinkers of antiquity in this painting. Sorry about that. Um, so Aristotle, just two things about him, right? He was a student of Plato, and a student of Plato as in Aristotle actually came to the academy and he studied and taught with Plato. But when they were discussing the philosophical ideas that each one of them embraced, they realized that they were in symphony, in harmony, sorry. They were in harmony is the way in which historians put it. So Aristotle actually leaves the school and formed his own lyceum. This is an image of the ruins of what we think, or where we think the lyceum was established. One of Aristotle's students is going to be Alexander the Great, the Macedonian warrior emperor who conquered Persia, or who traveled as far as Persia. And the reason why Aristotle is Alexander the Great's tutor is because both of them are from Macedonia. In the title De Anima for this book is the Latin translation for on the soul. Aristotle keeps using the idea of suhe that we were studying with Socrates before, but for Aristotle, unlike for Socrates and Plato, every living thing has a soul. Therefore, the definition of soul for Aristotle is going to be a little bit different from that presented to us by Socrates and Plato. this definition of the soul is actually later on going to be used by philosophers such as Aquinas and by Catholic religion to talk about why it is important for human beings to develop these essential or cardinal virtues, and how our soul gets improved, gets this distinctiveness of which Aristotle talks about through Catholic education. But let's talk about Aristotle's study. Aristotle and Socrates, or Aristotle and Plato, are going to be very, very different, because Aristotle wants to do a very systematic representation and understanding of everything that exists. So, in order to do this, Aristotle devised these different categories that you have on the PowerPoint. He talks about when beings exist, when there are things, they're going to have a substance, they're going to have accidents, they're going to have things that are necessary for them, they're going to have things that are accidental and not required for them to be of that kind. They're going to have properties, they're going to be related to other things. They're going to have each one of these different things is going to have, each thing that exists is going to have some sort of belonging to these different categories. So these are the same categories that Aristotle wants to study with regard to the soul. Because of this and the way in which Aristotle decides to start his study of what it means to have a soul and what a soul is, we're going to understand that what Aristotle is doing is called ontology. And ontology is a branch of pure metaphysics that examines the nature of beings as they are. Um, Aristotle tries to study the way in which a soul can be said to be of a certain nature, and because it has that certain nature, then it has to have this necessary element, and it might have these other elements that are not that important for us to understand or classify what the soul is. So later on, when he talks about the different sort of souls that could be actualized in a body, each one of those souls has necessary elements. Each one of those bodies have accidental elements that can be different, but if those accidental elements change, it doesn't really create any great disturbance. It doesn't change anything on what the object, what the subject of our study is. So ontology is going to be this branch of metaphysics that has to do with why and how things exist, what's their nature, what are their components. And obviously it's one of the most challenging areas of study, because we don't have um, clear cut equipment through which we can observe, for example, the soul, right? What Aristotle uses throughout his study is just comparisons and reasons, logical reasons, logical arguments, to try to analyze the different versions, the different varieties of souls that we might have. So some of the questions that Aristotle has that we should come back to on Monday are the ones that are on this slide. Is the soul connected to the body, right? One of the things that really concerned Aristotle was the idea that we talked about our soul being moved by passions. Our soul is filled with justice, our soul is filled with anger, but he wanted to understand if those are just metaphorical ways in which we present ideas, or if there is actually something in the soul that can be moved. For Aristotle, in order to understand this, he did a huge study in comparing what we mean by perceiving and what we mean by intellectual forces that affect the soul. Um, obviously this is a development that is going to be important even in our days, even if we don't think of the soul in the exact same way as Aristotle did, but we still want to understand what are the things that affect our intellectual development, and how can passions be connected to some sort of epistemological grounding for experience. So for Aristotle, he also wants to understand if the soul is a particular movement, right? Movement as in being affected of the soul. If everyone who has a soul is affected in the exact same ways, and what is it in the soul that allows us to be affected in that way. For Aristotle, thought seems to be the most important property that the soul has, the soul that we are said to have, right? However, he doesn't find a place where this thought happens, right? This intellectual form of thinking. Uh, Remember that this is 300 BC, so ideas of the brain and whatnot are not totally connected. But because of how we study the brain now and some of the things that Aristotle said in the Anima, there are some people who are studying Aristotle nowadays in connection with neurophilosophy. So again, some of the questions that Aristotle has is the soul connected to the body? How do the passions affect the soul? Is this in a real way or is it only a metaphorical way? And if thought is the most prominent property of the soul, then can that tell us where the soul is? And I'll upload this lesson now, and we'll come back for another 15-minute lesson on Aristotle's De Anima.